Well, good morning. Good Monday morning. This is Monday, July 24th, 2023. This is Focus on the News. I'm Senator Dick Black. Also retired Colonel Dick Black, and I was a JAG officer in the Pentagon at the time that there was a great deal of turmoil over don't ask, don't tell, and trying to decide whether we would integrate homosexuals into the military. There was an article that sort of got my attention, and it came from WTOP.com, and the title of it was 29,000 plus military vets kicked out over sexuality denied honorable discharge. And I wanted to talk to you about it because it's interesting. I was the chief of the criminal law division for the Army and the Pentagon. And so I really had spent a career dealing with this. I retired after 32 years of service in the Marines and the Army. And one of the things that I have noted is that the news media seems to like to create stories that portray traditional prosecutors and sheriffs and so forth as being somewhat evil people who are cracking down on these totally innocent people. Now, I'll tell you, I worked as a defense counsel for a law firm after retirement, and I became one of the most prominent, well, I guess the most prominent pardon attorney in Virginia. And so I've been to more prisons than almost anybody. I probably 10 prisons here in Virginia. I also, while I was on active duty with the military, I conducted an investigation of certain conditions in the federal prison at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. It's a very spooky place, interesting place to go. But in any event, there is this tendency to believe that the reason that we prosecute people is because we don't like their race or because we don't like their sexual behavior and so forth. But the fact is that people tend to be prosecuted for misbehavior. They are prosecuted for their conduct. Now, having been in a lot of prisons, visiting a lot of inmates, I can tell you that there are so many innocent people behind bars. You would, if they took a vote and all of the inmates, you know, are you innocent or guilty? You'd probably have a majority of them say they're innocent. They didn't do anything. They were victim of circumstances. And I've represented a good number of people, and so you know the background of what's going on. The fact is that people are prosecuted for being guilty. Now, I won't say that on some lower level offenses, they're not in the federal system, but in the state system, there's a great deal of pressure to overwhelm people and just have them plead guilty. Usually they are guilty, but every once in a while, I think for the lower level offenses, you do have mistakes made. But in any event, this particular issue surfaced by WTOP.com it implies that these 29,000 people they're talking about were kicked out over their sexuality, over their desire for somebody of the same sex to engage in various activities, sodomy and so forth, and that they were denied honorable discharges for that. Well, I happen to have done an enormous amount of research in the criminal law division of the U.S. Army at the Pentagon. And now what we were focused on is who was being prosecuted criminally. The article in WTOP.com is broader than that because it deals with who was discharged administratively as well as for criminal prosecution. But just reading through, it says new figures shared exclusively with CBS News are offering a detailed look at the scope of decades of discrimination. In other words, these people don't have bad discharges because they did something. It's because of discrimination. And it talks about them being kicked out because of their sexuality. In other words, they were kicked out not because of some sexual offense, but because they simply had a way about it. And it talks about them being denied honorable discharge. This is kind of like saying that somebody who's a mass murderer on death row, he's being denied his freedom. Well, yeah, I suppose in a sense you could say that, but to say someone is denied an honorable discharge presumes that someone is entitled to an honorable discharge, which is not the case at all. A person earns an honorable discharge from the military. Now, I'm not going to get too much into the figures that they give because they admit that the numbers that they're getting from various DOD offices are in fairly substantial conflict with one another. And I kind of understand it because there are issues about how do you categorize this or that. Do you refer to a general discharge under honorable conditions as something less than honorable? It gets a little bit complicated. But the fact is that there have been a good number of people discharged in regards to homosexuality. Now, here's something that I find interesting. After 1994, the military implemented this don't ask, don't tell policy. Basically what it says is that if somebody is homosexual and then keeps it to themselves and doesn't misbehave, then nobody's prying into their background. And in fact, it began to make it quite difficult to prosecute criminal actions by homosexuals because of all of the legal barriers that were instituted. It's kind of a manipulation of the system. But in any event, no one was discharged for being homosexual after 94. They weren't administratively discharged. They were not, so they could remain on active duty as long as they behaved and didn't make a big show of it. But here's the thing. In spite of that, from 94 until 2011, which is the time that they had figures, 14,000 service members were separated. They were removed from the military under the don't ask, don't tell policy that allowed homosexuals to serve. So you have to say, what is it? How come that was? How come there are 14,000 who got discharged? Now, keep in mind, we're talking about large numbers of people in the Department of Defense. You're talking about all of the military members of the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, this new space service, that kind of thing. But still, even still, you'd have to say, okay, well, what is it that got these 14,000 service members separated? Now, what is interesting is I'm not sure how different the separations after 94 were from the ones previous when it was unlawful for homosexuals to join the military. I haven't done figures, but because some of the numbers overlap. Other data that they have shows that from 1980 to 2011, there were a total of 35,000 individuals who got a discharge, and many of those were not honorable discharges. That seems almost comparable, just at a gut level, to the number that were discharged after Don't Ask, Don't Tell was implemented. Now, let me tell you, I cannot begin to convey to you how intensely we studied homosexuality during the lead up to Don't Ask, Don't Tell. In the end, Congress refused to integrate notorious homosexuals into the military, but they came up with this compromise approach, Don't Ask, Don't Tell. But what we did, we examined records of trial where there were certain offenses that could reasonably have involved homosexuals. We looked at records of trial. These were from courts of record, which are special court marshals empowered to adjudge a bad conduct discharge, and general courts martial. And so it was very difficult because there's no homosexual marker on criminal cases, but I knew from from decades of experience that all of the homosexual crimes had to fall within certain offenses under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, so that we would potentially narrow down the violations of the Uniform Code to this narrow group. And within that narrow group, I think we probably were picking up 95% of the homosexual cases. Now, then what you had to do is you had to filter out which cases involved offenses against women and girls, which cases involved males against males. There also were some lesbian cases, but not the crime is not nearly as high with them. So you'd have a situation where you would have forcible sodomy, and you'd have so we would go through this tremendous number of forcible sodomy cases, searching for some indicia that it may have been homosexual. And so the first thing that we look for is, do you have a crime of a male against a female? Okay, then it's not homosexual. But where you have a male against a male, then it is. And so in this way, we were able to screen. We put a tremendous amount of work into it. Eventually, we certified our results to the U.S. Congress, which had requested this information, and the Army was way ahead of the game because we had put a great deal of effort into it. In the end, we certified 102 cases that had been prosecuted during a 1-year time frame, and these were cases tried by these 2 higher level criminal courts, and it was interesting because we did a very exhaustive study that broke down the breakout of them. And here's what we found. Of these cases, 84% of all of the cases involved forcible criminal acts. In other words, the forcible attack of a homosexual against somebody else. So the vast majority of them were forcible actions. The victims, about half of the victims were other soldiers in the unit, and about half of the victims were children. And this would happen on post. You'd have a homosexual who would molest a child, and of course, terribly disruptive on a closed community like a military installation. Now, interesting, about 2/3 of all of the cases involved fraternization. Now, in the military, there is a prohibition on fraternizing, where you involve yourself in personal relations with people who are substantially different in rank, usually officers and enlisted, sometimes very senior enlisted and very junior enlisted people. About 72% of all of the offenses occurred within the military barracks. 22 of the victims had been sleeping at the time that they were attacked by their assailants. And although it was outside of the original scope of the investigation, we discovered 4 cases where homosexual soldiers had posed as Boy Scout troop leaders, and they had actually become Boy Scout troop leaders or leaders in some sense, and they had forcibly attacked little children who were Boy Scouts. Now, so this is sort of an overview of the types of things we were having. Now, in addition to the courts-martial, of course, there were, even 20 years ago, there was tremendous political pressure to let homosexuality skate and to let people who were homosexuals get away with misbehavior. And one of the favorite ways the commanders would do this was to issue an administrative discharge. Sometimes those administrative discharges were in lieu of court-martial. So you'd have a court-martial that was moving towards trial, and the defendant would ask to be discharged in lieu of court-martial. And with some frequency, commanders would say, okay, let's just get rid of them and get them out of here to where they're not disruptive anymore. So that would be one category. An interesting category historically is that if you go back far enough, there were a great number of people who self-identified as homosexuals to get out of going to Vietnam. I suspect most of them were actually homosexuals, but they had enlisted, they hadn't been removed from service because they were not detected or whatever. And then they would say, "Hey, wait a minute, I got to fight. Okay, I'm out of here. I'm a homosexual," is what they would say. And so there were quite a number of those who were discharged, and that would not be an honorable discharge in that situation. It wouldn't be dishonorable, but it would be other than honorable discharge. Or now in some cases also let me say, let me back up just a moment. Actually, I believe that those who self-identified to get out of going to combat were discharged under honorable conditions during Vietnam. So I correct myself there. They would get a general discharge under honorable conditions, or sometimes they would get something called an uncharacterized discharge. So it was a little bit as though they had never served one way or the other. So it's quite complex when you get into all of the various categories of discharge. But typically, you would have a situation that would not be terribly egregious. And I think of an example that I had. I believe I was at Fort Ord, California, and the AIDS epidemic was rampant, and there were two homosexual soldiers who lived together. Nobody knew that they were living together. Nobody knew they were homosexuals. And one of the homosexuals had AIDS. He didn't inform the other one. They had anal sex, and the other fellow was infected by the AIDS, very deadly AIDS virus. When the victim found out, he met the other soldier at the door, and he just beat him to a pulp. I mean, he was furious and just beat the living daylights out of the guy. That was presented to me. Now he didn't do any life-threatening injuries to him, but he gave him a sound thrashing. And the case came to me as the staff judge advocate, asking how do we proceed with this? And to me, in an odd sense, I had a degree of sympathy for the guy who was infected. And my response to the chief of the criminal law branch is, look, I can kind of understand this guy. He's been dealt a death sentence by this guy who decided he wanted to have unprotected anal sex with him. And so I said, it's a big mess, but I said, all we want to do is get rid of these guys. What do we gain by punishing some fellow who is going to die of AIDS because of this? So we ended up putting them out, and I'm not sure whether they got out general under honorable conditions, which is very possible, because that's how we would eliminate homosexuals who had not committed any offense. And in this case, I had made a decision, we're not going to charge an offense. So in this case, you had both of them eliminated with a general discharge under honorable conditions. Now, there's a statement that got my attention. This was from Legal Aid at Work's Gender Equity and LGBT Rights in other words, a pro-homosexual group. And they were cited in this WTOP article. And they made this statement. They said, the numbers confirm the magnitude of the discrimination and injustice suffered by so many service members who joined our armed forces with the hope of honorably serving our country. Well, this would imply that the people eliminated from service had somehow served honorably, and they were denied this discharge under honorable conditions. I don't think that's the case. And I want to give you just a few examples of the types of people who got bad conduct discharges or dishonorable discharges. There was an instance where when we submitted our report to Congress, there was an instance where 2 soldiers at night had gone into the showers. Now, keep in mind, this is in the military where in a barracks where you have showers where everybody just goes in and showers. They're not private showers, they're barrack showers. So these 2 homosexuals went into the shower. There was a smaller soldier who came in alone at night, and he went in to shower. When he did, the 2 homosexuals grabbed him. Of course, they're naked, he's naked, and he fought them off, but they were both bigger than he was. They beat up the smaller soldier, and then one of them took a towel and strangled the normal soldier, while the other one forcibly sodomized him, orally sodomized him, and I won't go into the details of what happened at the end of that, but in any event, then as the smaller soldier, beaten up badly, bloodied, sodomized, disgraced, humiliated, and as he was running out of the shower to get away from them, one of them, just to taunt him, grabbed a tennis shoe and threw it and smacked him on the head with the tennis shoe as he's running naked, fleeing from the shower. Now, at the time of the trial, which was pending, the trial was underway, but in the early stages. At that time, the victim was, about a year later, was in a psychiatric institution. He had been so terribly traumatized that he had simply lost his mind. He had gone insane. So that was one example. And so when you hear these loose allegations of discrimination, injustice, think about this fellow being strangled, being beaten, being forcibly sodomized, and then probably spending his life in psychiatric care. Another case, this was one of the Boy Scout cases where a Boy Scout little boy, while he was being out on a camping trip, this homosexual scout leader took him out in the woods, stripped him down naked, and then now this is a little boy and this is a big man, and the man anally sodomized him, and the little boy was screaming, crying out to God for help as his rectal organs were being ripped apart by this homosexual pedophile. Keep in mind, homosexuality and pedophilia are part and parcel of one package. You wouldn't know it from the media, from all the little comic types presentations on TV, but pedophilia is very much an element of the homosexual movement. Okay, so that was a Boy Scout. Now there was a rather humorous case, and this one was somewhat satisfying. There was one evening in the barracks. It might have been at Fort Hood, Texas. In the barracks back then, I don't know what it's like today, but they used to have double bunks, steel bunks, and there was a small, tough Texas boy, and he slept in the upper bunk, and there was a homosexual below him. And during the night, the Texas boy fell asleep. Homosexual crept up into his bunk, lowered his pants, and then attempted to anally sodomize him, to sodomize him in his butt. And in any event, there was a great commotion in the room, and there was a tremendous fight taking place, things being thrown about, people being thrown about, and the testimony of the NCO who was on watch that night was that the victim, in this case, he wasn't much of a victim, but the victim came storming out down the hall, and there were several soldiers there, and he ran out into the day room, and he yelled in anger, "Nobody butt fucks a Texan." and what that he had just beaten everything out of this homosexual who failed in what he was attempting to do. Give you one final example. There was a case out of Fort Jackson, a training base, Army training base, and there was a homosexual drill instructor, and he had been conducting drill and ceremony and so forth with the troops. And at the end, there was one troop he kept picking on, saying, you're not doing this or that right. He dismissed the other soldiers, and he ordered this one soldier to report to his room to his personal quarters up in the barracks. And so the recruit, when you're a recruit, I've been a recruit at Parris Island, South Carolina, you do what you're told. And so the soldier reported to his drill instructor and knocked on the door, "Sir, Private so-and-so reporting is ordered." Well, the next thing, this drill instructor, he's on the second story, and he pulls down this soldier's pants and begins to fondle him. So the recruit, realizing that he's in big trouble, storms out of the bedroom in the quarters and rushes into the bathroom. He slams the door, he locks it. At that point, the drill instructor is trying to bang down the door. He's so filled with lust for this young man that he's hammering down the door. And the boy, or the young soldier, opens the window, and he starts screaming down into the courtyard where there are other recruits, other Army recruits. And he starts screaming that he's being attacked by this DI who is a homosexual who wants to forcibly have sex with his rear end. And so while this DI finally the DI manages to break in the door, and the soldier starts climbing out the window to escape. Well, meanwhile, the other soldiers hearing, now these are just recruits. These are raw recruits, but they see what's going on, and God bless them. I mean, these were American kids, and they got together and they stormed up into the drill instructor's quarters, and they literally seized the drill instructor while he had his hand on the young recruit who was hanging from the window. And the DI wasn't trying to help him. The DI was trying to sodomize him, and the kid was literally risking his life to escape the guy. And so that was another guy who was given a general discharge. So when you hear these broad assertions that, and let me read this quote again: the numbers confirm the magnitude of the discrimination and injustice suffered by so many service members who joined our armed forces with the hope of honorably serving our country. This is just indicative of so much of the rubbish that is printed by the media, that is published on TV, on radio, and there is this inclination, and it's a terrible cultural inclination that we have to condemn the good and to lift up the bad. This is something from Scripture. You know, they will call good evil and evil good, and this is what happens. This is what's done in the media. This is how you have somebody like George Floyd become a national hero to the Black Lives Matter movement. This is a guy who had been in prison several times, and his most recent incarceration was because he had orchestrated a home invasion robbery and held a pistol to the belly of a pregnant Black woman and threatened to blow the guts out of her child through her belly if she didn't let them in. And in the course of it all, this poor pregnant woman gets violently pistol whipped by all these guys. This is the George Floyd that the American media held up and said, oh, what a wonderful fella he was, and how badly he was treated. Well, I can talk about his bad treatment. This is a guy who overdosed, massively overdosed, took a fatal dose of fentanyl and killed himself. But because he couldn't breathe from the fentanyl, they were able to mislead people to think that it was this legally authorized knee hold that Officer Chauvin was applying to prevent him from being violent, and the media were able to portray it as though somehow this George Floyd was this innocent fellow, happy-go-lucky fellow, and so it's just what we're seeing with this homosexual thing, what we're seeing with the George Floyd type thing, is this desire to stigmatize good people and to whitewash bad people. So I would give you some reasonable assurance that while nothing is perfect, DOD has never given homosexuals bad discharges for good behavior. So with that, we will say adieu until next Monday, and thank you for joining us. This has been Focus on the News. I'm Senator Dick Black. I'll see you next Monday.